everyone, and welcome to our regular Thursday morning live stream programming. We're thrilled to have you with us here today. Happy spring to you all. It's amazing how fast things can change, and it's so nice to have the warmth out there. As you all know, we have a number of programs coming up, and let me just put a little graphic on screen to show you some of the amazing upcoming talks we have. This coming Tuesday, we're going to do something special in collaboration with the CCA, where we are looking at this amazing documentary, Assassins. I finally finished it last night. It's supremely interesting, and it's all about the assassination of Kim Jong-un's brother in a Malaysian airport and the amazing story that surrounds the assassination by two young women. It's really interesting. And even better than the documentary, we'll have a discussion with the filmmaker, and then two outstanding folks who have worked on North Korean issues for many decades, Evans Revere and Ambassador Robert King. It's going to be a really, really, really interesting discussion, and I'm really looking forward to it. And best of all, when you register for it, you get the link to watch the movie beforehand so that you can come in with your questions, and I highly, highly recommend it. Next Thursday on the 13th, we're going to go down south to El Salvador and look at a lot of the things happening with President Bukele and, of course, his firing of the Attorney General and removal of 5 Supreme Court justices and all kinds of other things designed to consolidate his power. We have, among other folks on that panel, a leading journalist from El Faro, which, of course, is the leading newspaper in El Salvador. And we have a gentleman from the International Crisis Group. And that's going to be a really sort of hard look at what's happening in El Salvador. Then the following Wednesday, you'll note the special time and stream or date. We get into our 4th Russia disruption, where we'll feature the amazing lawyer, Jameson Firestone. And he'll be looking all at the Magnitsky Act and of course, what happened with his colleague, Sergei Magnitsky, who was, left to die in jail for protesting the fraudulent Russian government in attaching a massive tax bill to properties owned by or entities owned by Bill Browder. That's certainly going to be one not to miss. And then I haven't announced this yet in our regular digest, but on Thursday the 20th, we'll start looking at Iran and some of the major issues happening these days. We will be featuring Gary Sick on that day. And not on the screen on May 27th, we're going to feature reflections from an Israeli journalist on Israel and Iran and some of the major issues between those two countries. So as always, you know that our talks are on our YouTube channel. We just released yesterday our annual gala with Valerie Plame and Jim Comey. That was a really, really, really interesting conversation. Let me encourage you to go and check that one out. They had just a lot of interesting things to say. And I think, I feel very strongly that I read a lot of partisan media in the 2016 lead up to the election that was essentially savaging Jim Comey for a lot of his decisions. But boy, he was between a rock and a hard place. So that's it from me. And now I'm going to bring in our 3 speakers today, and I'll briefly introduce them all for you. And so we have leading the way, Dr. Todd Greentree, who needs very little introduction, but of course he is a historian, a former Foreign Service officer, and is currently over in Jordan in the Middle East. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Todd. It's great to see you again.
Thanks, Andy. Great to be here. Hello, everyone.
And then we have Baro Shalizi. Welcome, Baro. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
No, Baro, I'm just going to read your bio super quickly. Originally from Afghanistan, Baro was born in India and has lived in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the former Soviet Union before moving to the United States. Prior to moving to Santa Fe, he worked as assistant editor for the International Year of the Child, UNICEF in New York City, and later in advertising with Young and Rubicon. In 1999, he opened his own brokerage, Shalizi Real Estate. He served as the 2008 president of the Santa Fe Association of Realtors, and in 2015 served as president of the New Mexico Association of Realtors. And Baro, we are thrilled to have you with us here today. And last and certainly not least is the one and only Ambassador Vicky Huddleston. And all of us know Vicky well, but Vicky, of course, led U.S. diplomatic missions in 4 countries around the world, Cuba, Mali, Ethiopia, and Madagascar. And with that, Vicki, let me turn everything over to you.
Sandy, thank you. Good morning, everyone. What a wonderful, wonderful spring day. Excuse me. And I'm so glad that you've been willing to join us, even though it must be tempting to go outside. But it's so important. I remember almost 21 years ago now today, standing outside the State Department and watching as the smoke came up from the Pentagon, which had been hit by an aircraft taken over by Al Qaeda operatives. Of course, as well, the Twin Towers had been hit and a plane had crashed when the brave passengers had rebelled against the Taliban who had captured a plane over Pennsylvania. So, in retaliation, the United States invaded Afghanistan, where the Taliban had given succor to Al Qaeda. So, truly, the decision that we're looking at, that President Biden has made to withdraw our troops from Afghanistan, is indeed the end of an era. But of course, we don't actually know what's going to come next. And that's what we'll talk about today, a little bit about whether the decision was the right one. Then, um, what what were the decision points perhaps we missed during our time in Afghanistan? And finally, what's going to happen in the future? But let me begin by pointing out that we spent more than $40 billion giving assistance to Afghanistan in the hopes of building democracy and a pluralistic democracy. We spent more than $900 billion on our military effort there. More than 47,000 Afghans were killed, civilians during this conflict, and over 70,000 Afghan troops were killed. More than 2,370 US troops were killed, and more than 1,140 NATO troops were killed. Clearly, the United States and the West, our allies, NATO, have spent their blood and treasure over the past 21 years in Afghanistan. And now President Biden has said it is time to leave. We have achieved our objective. And we'll look at whether have we achieved our objective. Biden said that the war was launched uh, in order to respond to the terrorist attacks. He said that they were never meant to be it was never meant to be a multi-generational undertaking. He went on to say that we went to Afghanistan to get the terrorists who attacked us. And after 20 years of valiant sacrifice, it's time to bring those troops home. His rationale is that it's time, mainly, and that we've achieved at least the objective of degrading Al Qaeda and also pushing out of power the Taliban that allowed the attack to take place from Afghanistan. U.S. troops are already leaving. NATO had more troops at this time in Afghanistan than we did, 7,000. Those 7,000 are on their way out, as well as the remaining 2,500 U.S. troops. We have sent in Rangers in order to assure an orderly and transparent withdrawal, not a withdrawal like Vietnam. So let me begin by giving some of the reasons other than the one I gave, of why I think, or others think, that this is a good idea. One of the main reasons uh, for the withdrawal, according to the experts, and perhaps it is the principal reason, is that the Al Qaeda has in fact been almost completely degraded. It has approximately 400 to 600 remaining adherents and troops in the country. And Al Qaeda is much stronger in Somalia, where we are not the major factor, but rather Kenyan, Ethiopian, and Somali troops themselves are fighting Al Shabaab. In the Sahel, Al Qaeda is also much stronger, where the French, along with Sahelian governments and the Europeans, are fighting Al Qaeda. So why should we stay in Afghanistan, where Al Qaeda is greatly degraded, and we perhaps do not have to worry that they will come back there? Perhaps we were better putting our resources elsewhere. Biden also said that he wanted to focus his interests and resources on the major issues of our time and our competitors, who are Russia and China. Moreover, Pakistan likely wants a stable Afghanistan and will do its best to ensure that Al Qaeda is not resurgent. However, they likely will not oppose a resurgence of the Taliban. But many people say we should at least keep those 2,500 troops to ensure the gains that have been made, especially the women and the girls and schooling and some democracy, as well as protect those people that have helped us, which I think is a really critical issue. And the administration has not, despite many letters from national security leaders asking the administration, please do not leave behind, provide an easy way to provide visas for those people, such as interpreters and others that have worked with us. So that is the reason for keeping the 2,500. But the reason for not keeping the 2,500 is that may well be that the Taliban will gain more area, more strength, and then once again we would be forced to increase our presence. I have not seen a poll. I looked for one, but I believe in general the American public wants the end of the forever war, as it is called. In addition, a coalition of veterans organizations recently wrote to the president that we should not be, quote, asking our women and men in uniform to remain entangled in a conflict with no clear military path to victory. And then let me just end by saying President Ashraf Ghani has recently written a lengthy article in Foreign Policy saying that he accepts, he didn't say agrees, with the United States decision to withdraw, and pointed out this is an opportunity for the Afghan people to achieve real sovereignty. And in addition, it should undercut the Taliban's claim that they're fighting the Afghan government because they are allowing foreigners into their country. So the United States will stay involved, and we can talk a little bit about that amongst ourselves. But there are the principal reasons that we're ending this conflict on September 11th after 21 years in Afghanistan. Todd, what do you have to say about that?
What do I have to say is, well, okay, 20 years. So think of it like this giant wheel. And at the start, we were at the top. We just overthrown the Taliban and we were ready to go. Now the wheel has made a full circle, except for this time, we're at the bottom. We're underneath the wheel. What a horrible place to be making a decision. So I'm going to make a couple points, just throw some things out to think about. Number one, forever war, endless war. Everybody's buying this bumper sticker, endless war, without thinking about it. That's because there's nothing to think about. It's a strategic fallacy. There's no such thing as a forever war. Every war has to end. The most important thing is how it ends. So there's the key point, and I'm sure you all know that, right? Just because we're pulling out, that we're exiting, that is not the same thing as war ending, much less peace coming out of it. So whatever we say about, hey, we're done, we achieved our interests, you got to take into account the fact that we, the United States, are responsible for that situation. We are the prime actors in the perpetuation of this war. So I think that's something that maybe that doesn't drive a decision, and Biden certainly is not trying to pretend that he's making the decision based on some policy ideal. It's very pragmatic, but I think that's something extremely important, and there's a lot of implications for what I just said about this that we can talk about. Now, the reason that there's no such thing as a forever war is because what really drives the level of effort that combatant adversaries put in and the duration of that effort is what the 19th century founder of modern strategy, Clausewitz, called the value of the object. And what President Biden has basically determined is that Afghanistan is no longer worth the value of the object. It's no longer worth it. So that's however you want to spell it. That's the core of that issue. It's too soon to judge the consequences of that decision for the United States. We know there will be some reputational damage, sort of an imperial embarrassment. But what else there might be in the long run, we're not able to say. What we can say is that by entering into direct power sharing negotiations with the Taliban, we violated the principles and the policy that we are attempting to uphold in Afghanistan, principally support for democracy. However low quality that may have been, that is what we've been trying to do also in Afghanistan, not just fight terrorists. And by abandoning Afghans, we've also basically abandoned efforts to strengthen rule of law, to nurture civil society, women's rights, as Vicky mentioned, and human rights themselves. And there's a great contradiction that we are responsible for. Vicky, when she laid out some of the statistics, basically said, if you're thinking about loss of lives, that on the order of 150 to 160,000 people have died in the last 20 years because Al-Qaeda killed on the order of 3,000 people in New York. In no way can you make an argument that this was proportional to what happened. And on the order of 40,000, over 40,000 of those people were civilians, non-combatants. That's the number that's been documented, so it's probably an underestimation. I'm not going to go into more detail, but to me, I think, as we're focused on where is this going and what are the consequences of it, it's really important to keep in mind the question, what went wrong in Afghanistan? And let me just say that what went wrong happened in December of 2001. In other words, immediately after we overthrew the Taliban. Everything else that has taken place since then has been an attempt to compensate from that quote unquote original sin. And if we're interested, we can go into details on what that original sin was. So I think I'll stop there and let's keep going.
Oh, I'm not going to let you get off the hook so easily. Tell us what that original sin was before I go on to Baro.
So there's a thing called the what if, the counter argument, and that's sort of like the thing that didn't happen, and it makes a big difference if that thing that didn't happen isn't just some idea you have out there, but it actually was an option that was considered. And when the United States and its coalition partners, along with the Afghans, overthrew the Taliban Emirate, they had a conference in Bonn, Germany, that created the government, made Hamid Karzai eventually the president, and they had something called the Loya Jirga, which is the traditional means of establishing political legitimacy in Afghanistan, not democratic elections. And there was a proposal to include the Taliban in those talks. The Afghans themselves, Karzai and his team, wanted to do that. But of course, we were under the panic and the influence of 9/11, and we wanted to kill terrorists. And we mixed up the Al-Qaeda, the terrorists who attacked us, with the Taliban, the people who gave them, who hosted them. And that was the original sin, was we decided we just extended the war from Al-Qaeda onto making war against the Taliban. And there's more to say about that, but that's basically what the original sin was.
Right. Thank you. Baro, looking forward to hear your comments, and very nice to meet you virtually.
Likewise, it was interesting hearing both your comments. I have a slightly different take on it, but encompassing those views in that the Afghans originally were very happy when the US came in and got rid of Al-Qaeda and attacked the Taliban, kind of removed that because it had been very oppressive under their rule. Part of the things that then the Afghans started resenting was who was supporting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban? Where were they getting their training? Where were they getting their funding? Nothing was done about Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. And the people really resented that because they felt that had it not been for the funds coming from Saudi Arabia, had it not been from the training camps in Pakistan, we would not have had Taliban or Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So that was one part. The second part was, and I'll go to the pre-original sin, which was that the US talked about wanting to bring democracy, but had it been allowed to the people and to a vote or anything of that nature, or even the Loya Jirga, the person who would have been chosen would have been the king, not Hamid Karzai. He could have united the people. They would have come behind him. Instead, the US insisted on putting their person in, which the people, again, did not like. They did not want Hamid Karzai. They viewed Hamid Karzai as an American lackey. He had been working with Americans in the Bush administration prior to that. They had much more confidence in the king, but the US didn't allow that to happen. So they started losing the minds and hearts of the people. And then, as Todd brought up, now to be having talks, including the Taliban, have totally disillusioned the Afghan people because they're like, wait a second, if you all were here for democracy, human rights, women's rights, etc., how can you possibly go back and talk to them when they have refused to accept that they would keep women's rights, would allow education, would allow any of those things? So that's sort of where their issue came in. Then also this bit about, endless war, never-ending war, troops, costs. I think what both of you did bring up, which is really the crux of it, is whether the US feels it's worth being there or not. Because let's face it, it's been 76 years since the Second World War ended. We still have troops in Japan and in Germany. We have troops in South Korea. So that isn't really, oh my God, it's been 20 years. 20 years is nothing compared to 76 years. But it's the feeling that Afghanistan isn't worth it at the moment, which I forget about being an Afghan. I just think that's actually the wrong attitude, because we don't have many friends in that region. Whether we look at Iran, we look at Pakistan, we look at Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Yes, Kazakhstan cooperated with us, but they took their pound of flesh in return for it. So not having people there who can actually do some ground truthing, making sure they know what's going on. You can do so much by listening devices, satellites, etc. But having people actually there makes a huge difference. And I sort of agree, but not totally, about Pakistan wanting a stable Afghanistan. They don't want a stable Afghanistan. They just want an Afghanistan that can't yet actually function and do anything against them. But that is it. So they will continue to undermine what's going on with the Afghan government. So that too is not going to be too stable. And with China moving in the way it does, I know they still have eyes on some of the minerals and things that come out of Afghanistan. I can easily see them going back in and doing more. And the way they've been doing it in Africa, Latin America, is on the surface by winning the hearts and minds of the people. They bring in infrastructure, they bring in things for the people, without the people then being aware of the price they're going to have to pay for that, and the loans they're getting that they'll never be able to repay, things of that nature. So I could see countries like China moving in. I can see Russia getting more influence. And since we no longer really have any country there that is a true ally, I feel it's a mistake to totally pull out and not to actually have a presence there. I mean, funding, giving support to the Afghan government, I don't think is enough. So that's just my view on it.
Todd, I see your microphone's open. Go ahead.
No. Let me just address one point, which is the back to this value of the object. Keep in mind, of course, that I talked about the 20-year wheel. For Afghans, it's a 40-year wheel that's just turning around the second time. That the last time we got involved in Afghanistan, remember, it was to fight the Soviets who had invaded, and we weren't really interested in victory. We're just imposing costs on them. So that was a forever war, in the sense that we were willing to keep putting money into the Mujahideen as long as they were willing to fight the Soviets. That could have kept going, except for that the Soviet Union collapsed. So it's this idea that, well, we only care so much about Afghanistan. Our interest in fighting terrorists in Afghanistan has always been far too narrow a conception. Not that it's not important and that it's relevant, but foreign policy as a whole, national security as a whole, has to take into account much larger issues as well, including the principles that we're talking about, supporting democracy, women's rights, and all those other things. Where does all this end up in terms of Biden's decision? Geostrategically, the implications of the decision are that in terms of other than the most narrow national security interest in counterterrorism that we're going to, once troops are out, I assume we'll maintain some sort of intelligence and covert presence that allows for some kind of counterterrorism. Basically, what we're doing is yielding up Central Asia as a security area for the United States. In other words, Afghanistan, if you think about it, just turn the globe around, Afghanistan is almost exactly opposite of us on the globe. Even though we are a global power, we are the global power, we're saying Central Asia, Russia, it's your sphere of interest. You were the primary player. China, your interest is growing, although your security involvement is limited. And we're just not going to be players in that world. And I think there are some real considerations to be had about this larger issue that range from, for example, we're giving up Kandahar Air Base. This is a major reinforced airfield that happens to sit on the eastern flank of Iran and the western flank of Pakistan and India. That's a strategic asset that we're just saying goodbye to. The issue of Pakistan, absolutely. We never effectively engaged with Pakistan and the ISI, its intelligence service agency. We never got a handle on that problem, and that's part of the reason why, or maybe the most reason why, Afghanistan is unquestionably a strategic failure.
Baro, do you have anything in return?
No, I totally agree with that we didn't go as far as we should have. And now I'm talking from the point of view of the US, because I am a US citizen, is that we didn't go as far as we should have. And to me, I think the message, the optics that's out in the world for a global power to pull out of any part of the globe and say, we're no longer a player here, is not giving a good message to the world. So again, I think that from that point of view, we're making a strategic mistake. Only time will tell. And again, there's been some talk about, well, if we see things aren't going well, we can re-engage. Re-engaging is going to be very difficult because there has to be a reason to actually go back in. So, when the topic was first brought up about, Biden's decision to withdraw, and of course, Trump had planned on that even earlier, so that he had wanted to withdraw by May. I had been very uncomfortable, not only thinking in terms of what will happen to Afghanistan. I personally don't think the Taliban will necessarily be able to take over fully. There will be opposition, not only from the Northern Alliance, but they're split within, because they're the groups that are taking their orders from Pakistan's ISI, and they're the ones that chaff against it. And once the quote unquote foreign enemy is gone, which united them, now they will splinter. They will have some issues amongst themselves. So I don't see them necessarily taking over, but I do see civil war coming. And when that happens and the whole thing starts to disintegrate, who will come into the vacuum is going to be another big question.
Right, China. I want to go back. We've started on U.S. national security. And so I want to go back to this idea that Todd actually raised, and that's forever wars. And I really think that label was something that really hurt the U.S. concept of what we were doing. Because I would argue that right now we were not on the cusp of victory, but we had essentially done what we needed to do and would have continued to have succeeded in that had we stayed. Yeah, yes, my spots have suddenly changed, right? So with the troops we had there and NATO, about 10,000 altogether, we could have helped the Afghan government avoid a civil war that you're talking
Mhm.
about, the possibility of, Aro. We could have, as Todd points out, protected human rights or helped to women's gains and the fledgling democracy. And even more than that, we could have, and I thought these were great points, Todd, um, preserved our interest in the Eurasian land mass rather than turning it over to Russia, China, or a combination of both of them. All we needed to do was stop thinking about this as a open war. And I think, Baro, you kind of touched on that at the beginning, saying, well, we still have troops in Korea. We still have troops in Japan. I mean, that's what the American people, and I think the Biden administration have failed to seize. And it's not just in Afghanistan. It's also in the Sahel, in Somalia. It's when you have a counterterrorism effort, it's different than a conflict against nation states. It's a lot less resources, which of course we have very few, not very few, but much less in Afghanistan, and much less in the death toll. What we're essentially doing is reinforcing governments so that they can carry out the fight against the terrorists and provide stability in their own countries. And instead of that, we've seen it as an open kind of nation state conflict and labeled it a forever war. And therefore, I think we have to come home just when it seems to me we had a chance of some sort of success.
Yeah, so let me just play off that a little bit. I should have mentioned at the start, some of you probably know this, but as a Foreign Service officer, spent over 30 years mostly doing political military work. Was in 5 wars. Afghanistan, I spent 4 years in Afghanistan as a political advisor to combat units. And it fits this pattern. Everybody's talking about the blood and treasure. Yes, a lot of treasure, but most of that was spent supporting US combat troops. And this is where we're just terrible at this stuff. This was the same mistake we made in Vietnam, that maybe you can make the argument we didn't understand the nature of the war in Vietnam, and we never should have sent combat troops in, but we didn't know any better. And it was the middle of the Cold War. So we were afraid the Soviets were going to get an advantage and dominoes were going to fall. But there's no excuse for this in Afghanistan. We never should have had combat troops in there. That's what I'm talking about with the original sin. If you look at the current costs of all these wars combined, they at no point in the last 20 years did they ever surpass both Iraq and Afghanistan, plus the misnamed global war on terror, never surpassed 6% of GDP. Current costs of the entire US defense establishment is about 4% of GDP. A US soldier has not died in Afghanistan for over a year. So yes, this is very sustainable. And I'm going to stop there, but depending on where the conversation goes, I have some thoughts about why this forever war business became such an issue.
Oh, I want to hear that. Are you saying, you may not be saying, I just don't know how to interpret your initial remark there. are you saying that we shouldn't have sent combat troops at all to Afghanistan? Can you
After the
clarify?
overthrow of the Taliban.
Okay, when it was focused, we
And
could have just
and then
gone after
and
Al Qaeda.
really the final battle, to sort of battles do matter, was operation called Anaconda in the Tora Bora Mountains in March of 2002, that was basically dispersed Al Qaeda. After that, there was really no need for troops in combat, perhaps small special forces units, special operations units, like very similar to what we're doing now. Instead, we started looking for war. If we didn't have American troops in combat, we weren't really there. And it was this whole period at the end of in the Bush administration, very early on, when we weren't oh, no, we don't do nation building. We're not going to do nation building. And it was basically Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, who said, oh, no, we do, and sort of sucked us into it bit by bit. I'm not saying that Blair was wrong. What I am saying that our standoffishness from being involved in it while sending in US combat troops was terrible strategy.
Baro, what's going to happen to the Afghan people?
So they're going to be kind of stuck like a grain of wheat between the millstones as things grind over there, and they're going to get ground down in the process, because whether we're there or not, there's still a lot of other forces working there that, as I said earlier, they really don't want a totally stable Afghanistan. They just want it to be at the point where it can't do any harm to anybody else. But one thing that, Vicky, you had brought up earlier that I want to reiterate, because again, it's the optics, is if when we pull out, we do not do anything to help all those interpreters and people who worked with us, and they are then targeted, it will become an issue for us in other parts of the world, because people will be reluctant to help out, knowing that we won't be there to support them when they'll need it. But as I said, for Afghanistan itself, at the moment, I don't see a pretty future ahead. Where it will dissolve, how much of what has been gained will be lost, I'm not really 100% sure, but I do think they will lose a lot.
For Christ's sake, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, acknowledged that civil war was very likely an outcome. It says, but we're going to stay in diplomacy first. But in an active war, as George Shultz famously said, in an active war, diplomacy, not backed by force, is largely bunk.
That's right.
And also Hillary Clinton has come out very strongly against withdrawal of US troops. And, I think one of Hillary's messages, in fact, is her great concern about women and girls. But to go back, Baro, thank you for reiterating this. About the people who've helped us. And it strikes me so strangely. I mean, nobody knows the Afghan war better than Biden. He was involved in all during the 8 years of the Obama-Biden administration. And I can understand, the desire to get out, although I don't agree because I think it's bad timing. But to say we're getting out without a plan to take care of those people, I just don't get it. And I do urge everyone to contact their congressman, write letters, that we really must do something about this. And I'm hoping that the fact that Biden recently increased the refugee total up to over 60,000 is because he is planning, hopefully, to do something about the people who have worked with us.
I hope so.
I hope so.
I want to make another point related to this, but it's talking about the larger consequences. that we can see the outlines, but not really know what impact it's going to have. But one of them, it's this idea of, well, Al-Qaeda's degraded, and blah, 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 because yeah, they're degraded, but there's 600, that's the number they put on it. I've been in wars where the CIA said, oh, there's 5,000 guerrillas, and then there's a peace agreement and 25,000 come out of the bush. So hang on, I'm not so sure about those numbers, but let me point out that the grandchildren, Osama bin Laden's grandchildren, are growing up in the Pakistani tribal areas and the border region of Afghanistan. And that gets to another idea, another issue here, which is it's not enough to say, oh, the Taliban, they don't really have international interests, so we can negotiate power sharing with them. They've already achieved something by this. We legitimized them when we agreed for that to negotiate with them and exclude the Afghan government from those talks. Just like Henry Kissinger legitimized the North Vietnamese when he agreed to hold peace talks in Paris with them and exclude the South Vietnamese from it. So what is the implication of this in Afghanistan? The Taliban were the first to create the Islamic Emirate. And they started as jihadists. They achieved power on the basis of their Islamic jihadism. They've already, by being legitimized, they've already legitimized the idea jihad is forever. That's the forever war. Jihad is forever, and it works. They are inspiring Islamists around the world as a result of this. And that's one reason that I believe very strongly that that the decision to withdraw is a fundamental strategic error.
That is a great point. I haven't heard it made, but it is a very valid point. It will reinforce jihadism wherever it is, and it looks as if the United States, since the Trump administration, has increasingly been unwilling to really engage in putting our boots on the ground to stop terrorists around the world. I want to turn, if you don't mind, Sandy, I'm just going to read Diane's question,
Please.
Diana Baker, because we only have one right now. She says, in light of the U.S. description of forever wars, can you briefly give a short history of Afghanistan's wars with Britain and Russia, pardon, and why foreign powers seem focused on enforcing their will on Afghanistan? And then she goes on, it seems to me it is the Afghans who are involved in various forever wars, including internally between tribes. Well, I guess, Baro, you're the best one to answer that.
Well, it's an interesting question in the sense that the Afghans didn't always bring the wars upon themselves. They didn't ask the Brits to come and invade. They didn't ask the Russians to come and invade. Going all the way back to Alexander the Great, we were on the crossroads, or we were in the way of other things that were going on, other wars that were going on. Afghanistan's in a very strategic place in Central Asia. So from that point of view, the wars have been brought to them. But one thing we can learn is that the Afghans have never taken kindly to anybody else being on their territory. They have always fought back, and they have always basically won a war of attrition over time. It's just a matter of they'll keep plugging away and just doing what they can to get rid of the invader, because none of the invaders came in with the idea of we're going to try and make this a better place, or we're going to bring things for the people. It was always because of their own self-interest, and only that. They didn't expand beyond it. So that part is, has been beyond the control of the Afghans. The internal things that have happened, within tribes, you see that everywhere in the world where there is tribalism. We can look at the Native American tribes fighting each other before the white man showed up. We can look at it in Afghanistan. We can look at the different parts of India, the various principalities. They were always fighting each other. We can look at all of the kingdoms of Europe fighting each other. That, unfortunately, is human nature. So I'm not sure one can totally get away from that until the country really coalesces as a country. And it was very interesting. I heard this from another Afghan just a few nights ago at a little dinner party where the woman commented and she said, people talk about Afghanistan and its history of 5,000 years, whatever, but really modern day Afghanistan's only been around for about 250 years. And there are many different ethnic groups and tribes that were brought together within this geopolitical area that did not always get along. And so that has not coalesced. There was that peace under the time of the king, and why I felt that if the king had been allowed to come back, he would have been able to bring everybody together because they remembered that things were relatively peaceful during his reign. But overall, there's still a lot of animosity. That's why I think in many ways we'd end up with a civil war instead of the Taliban coming to power, because there isn't that unity that's going to back up behind the Taliban. The Taliban are primarily Pashtun. And so the rest of the groups will oppose them. And then you'll have another civil war again. I don't know if that really answered the question, and I'd love to hear Todd's views on it also, as to what he thinks on those particular issues.
Well, let me address this issue. You've probably, everybody's heard graveyard of empires.
Mm-hmm.
Baro, I think, has it exactly right. It's not the graveyard of empires. It is the crossroads of competing empires. That is by virtue of its strategic location. And this is true. We're not talking about a 20-year wheel or a 40-year wheel. Mm-hmm. We're talking about millennia here. And it's a function of geography as much as anything else. Right. So in that sense, we are participants. The United States had became participant in this competition with Islamic extremists who used a very interesting, very genius-like asymmetric method to attack us from Afghanistan as the platform in the US homeland. But let me make an additional point about that, because part of the question was about the British. The British fought 3 wars in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And it's not that, yes, they suffered imperial embarrassments in each one. Some Afghans can be great fighters, and so they did inflict some serious defeats in battles. But in all 3 of those wars, in the end, the British were able to realize their interest, which was to ensure that Russia, this was called the Great Game, right, that Russia was not able to encroach and approach India, which was the jewel in the crown, the British Raj. Mm. That was the objective. And in all 3 of those wars, they were able to achieve that. The United States, from that perspective, fought 2 wars in Afghanistan, one during the Cold War, in which they used the Mujahideen, organized through Pakistan, to inflict costs on the Soviet Union, so great that the Soviets were forced to withdraw. And that, you can argue, had an impact on the collapse of the Soviet Union because in a sense it was their Vietnam, something that helped expose the bankruptcy of the Soviet model. It's this current one that, in the sense of what we're talking about now, has been truly a strategic failure.
You know what I keep thinking about, and here's a question for both of you, maybe the last question. As I see, we're coming to the end of time, and I don't see any other questions. But to focus on the future a little bit, you know, we said possible civil war. I pointed out it may be very difficult for Al Qaeda and or ISIS to have a resurgence in Afghanistan. It may, however, be an encouraging example to terrorist movements elsewhere. But what happens if there is a civil war in Afghanistan? I mean, are we prepared, Todd, just to say, well, we've already washed our hands of it when we see, the Taliban killing more and more people? Attacks have already gone up by 37%. We know that in Taliban occupied areas, very few women are allowed into professions other than education and healthcare. Are women going to lose their rights? Will we, in the end, find that we have to intervene? Or will we see China or Russia expand its influence? Or is it more likely that it will be Pakistan?
Yeah, I've got another scenario for that. So it's back to the lily pads. I hinted about, that I presume that we'll be retaining some form of CIA covert presence in Afghanistan. We've got several strike forces that have been long in operation, Afghan strike forces completely operating independently of the military against terrorists. That's where this all started. Remember the triple nickel, the teams that went in, they were in not long after 9/11. They were on the ground in the Panjshir Valley, where the last holdouts, some of the last holdouts against the Taliban were. I suspect that if, let's say, the Taliban get the upper hand, which they very, very may well do, there will be plenty of resistance, as Baro said, against them, and it will be extremely cheap and not necessarily secret, but at least covert, that to provide support for anti-Taliban forces. I suspect that would be a more likely course of action.
Yes, and just to kind of wrap up my comments on it, is that if it does devolve into a civil war and there's some kind of a vacuum or somebody sees an opportunity, I'm still concerned about the overall Wahhabist agenda and where that's coming from, who's funding it, and again, that we're not doing anything about that, and that they are really pushing for this extreme Islamic view and are funding it. So I could still see something coming in there as a result. What kind, and again, since they're not from Afghanistan, they're not concerned about using Afghanistan as a base and having it bombed again or attacked again, because they themselves are not being attacked. They're not being eliminated. So it may be just a small opportunity, but depending on how bad the situation in Afghanistan gets, I feel it will become fertile ground for somebody to use it. So we'll see. Time will tell. We can meet again in a year or two and have another discussion.
That discussion might have to be sooner. Yes, Todd. Sorry.
Yeah, I want to make a closing comment. That's all right.
Yes, indeed.
But I hinted I had some thoughts about what influences on the Biden decision. A lot of voices, include, saying, don't do this. We gotta stick with it. And it's, we were in the Foreign Service, Vicky, right? You get your say, but when the decision's done, then you get with it and you execute. So that's where the military came out. The military felt very strongly that, no, we got this. We need to stay in here. It's not killing us to keep a couple thousand guys. Plus we got NATO, so we can handle it. So why now? Of course, everybody knows Biden couldn't stand Karzai. He got up and threw his napkin down and walked out of a dinner. He was really tired of these Afghans. And there's what I felt. I saw way too much of this. Blame the Afghans syndrome. And I'm not accusing the president of that. But I am sort of looking at a 2 here and a 2 there and seeing how they add up. And it's a strain. This is about the United States. This is not about Afghanistan. There's a strain of thought that has been rattling about academia and the think tanks, but has not really become evident in our foreign policy, of course, until Trump came in, but trying to get some coherence out of that is pretty difficult. But it's these people called, the restrainers, the idea of offshore restraint, that you can get out of your involvement in all these places and you just keep your military assets and you fly in when you need to and you fly out, but otherwise you just stay out of this. This is a very, I think of this, as a very libertarian sort of foreign policy approach to foreign policy. And I get thinking about that a little bit. Oh, hang on. Trump had appointed this guy to be ambassador to Afghanistan. His name is Will Ruger. And I know Will Ruger. He is a dyed-in-the-wool, Paul Rand libertarian. How do I know that? He's the head of foreign policy for the Koch brothers organization. They've become extremely active in foreign policy in the last few years. And not just in the little tiny Cato Institute, but they've been out and around putting a lot of money into this. Why did Trump name Will Ruger to do this? Ruger has been extremely outspoken for years on Afghanistan. We got to get the hell out. We have no business. That's his position. And you mentioned these veterans, this coalition of veterans organizations that oppose. Well, there's a connection there too, because of course vets, are going to oppose getting involved in forever wars that have no clear aim. I mean, that's what Vietnam was all about in the end, right? That's why those black flags, you still see those black flags flying in New Mexico. You ask a high school kid what those mean, they have no idea. But there's still plenty of people who do know. Why am I bringing this up? Because the lead of that lead organization of that coalition that wrote the powerful letter and got a lot of press was called Concerned Vets for America. Just going to leave it here. Their primary source of funding, the Koch brothers. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we're out of time. I will add to that thought, Todd, just from my observation when I was at Defense, and I would attend meetings at the National Security Council with the State Department, with the CIA, with all the foreign affairs agencies. And Biden's advisors were more liberal than Obama's. And that is kind of my thinking, that Obama, I don't know if this is even a liberal policy, but it's probably a progressive policy that to want to get out of foreign wars, that this does fit to some degree Biden and his advisors' foreign policy views. which are going to be hard, I think, for some of us who are more traditional in our approach to foreign policy. Thank you both. It's been a really interesting discussion. Over to
Thank
you,
you.
Sandy.
Yes, thank you all so much. That was an absolutely fantastic discussion. Thank you, Baro. Thank you, Todd, as always, and thanks once again to Vicky. Vicky, I've got to total up the number of conversations you've moderated for us. It's quite something, and Todd, of course, has given too many talks for me to even begin counting. So anyway, thank you so much to all three of you. Super great conversation. And a reminder to all the folks out there that we have, of course, a great film coming up on Tuesday. You can get the film now in your a link in your inbox, and you can start watching it. I promise you, it is absolutely fascinating. So I hope to see you on Tuesday at 6 p.m. and Thursday, of course, for our next regularly scheduled live stream. Until then, have a great day. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.